history of Kenya's anti-colonial rebellion. I've read the abstracts, and what I can be able to pick out is that they're going to be talking about how Mau Mau also extended outside Kenya's borders to Tanganyika and so on. Yep. Professor Anderson is known, maybe the historians, for one of his major works. It's called The Histories of the Hunt, was published in 2005. He chronicles over 800 eyewitnesses that had not been recorded before. And the gist of it, if I understood it well, is that he exonerates the Mau Mau as terrorists, a label they had been given before, and reveals the real terrorists to be the British settlers in compliance with the British government, the PCA Church, and the Presbyterian Church especially, okay? And so with just that, I'd like to welcome Professor Anderson so that he can also maybe introduce his colleagues first, and then look forward to listening to his discussions about the Mau Mau outside Kenya's borders. Karibu sana, Professor Anderson.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Now. Yeah, thank you very much indeed for the introduction. So the paper I'm going to present to you today on Mau Mau in Tanganyika comes from shared research that I've done with my colleagues, Jonathan Jackson and Idi Magoti. I'll explain that in a moment and put the project in more context. But firstly, let me share my screen and show you my PowerPoint. Excuse me, I can't share the screen at the moment. Can someone adjust the settings so that I can share the screen and show the PowerPoint?
You can go ahead, Prof.
Yeah, I have done. Good, thank you. Okay, that's better. So thank you for the opportunity this morning to speak to this important and really quite inspiring conference organized by our colleagues in the Department of History and Archaeology in the University of Nairobi. It's a privilege for me to be asked to present this keynote address on the third day of the meeting, and I shall do my best to deliver a paper that I hope will add something new, some new dimensions at least, to our discussions. For me, the history of Mau Mau is still alive and active. And as I push my own research further forward, I find there is much to discover that is new, while much of what we think we already know ought to be questioned and perhaps interrogated anew. It's in need of re-examination and reconsideration. And I think we've seen some of that in the proceedings of the last 2 days. Now, it's been almost 20 years since the banning order on the Mau Mau movement was lifted by the Kibaki government in Kenya. And in that period, the study of the history of Kenya's anti-colonial resistance has flourished as never before. This conference therefore marks a very timely effort to draw together the many threads of this. But as we've already heard over the past 2 days, not all of these threads can easily be woven into the same tapestry. Many of the key events of the emergency remain contested in their detail and indeed in their meaning and interpretation. Even the roles of principal protagonists in the struggle remain contested and unclear. Kenya's historians, as Margaret Gachini reminded us in her comments yesterday, are acutely aware of the importance of evidence rather than inference. Yet they still sometimes find it hard to make themselves heard above the clamor of populist pronouncements and far-flung theories about the emergency and Mau Mau. And we've seen examples of that in this conference too. So there remains much work for us as historians to do. In that spirit of fostering new research and nurturing fresh perspectives on this history from the evidence we have to hand, I want to tell you about a project that I'm now developing in collaboration with my colleagues Idi Magoti at the University of Dar es Salaam and Jonathan Jackson at the University of Cologne. This project explores Mau Mau's history in Tanganyika. Our collaboration draws upon Dr. Magoti's research into the history of the Kikuyu diaspora in Tanzania, using interviews he has conducted and is still undertaking with Kikuyu communities in northern, central, and southern Tanzania. He and Dr. Jackson have also both explored archival records in Dar es Salaam and will undertake further work next year, also in Nairobi in the archives there. While Dr. Jackson has also assisted me in identifying and reviewing relevant colonial archives held in London, including some very important reports held within the Migrated Archives, the FCO 141 papers in the National Archives at Kew in London. Many of these sources have not before been examined by historians, and so the history of Mau Mau in Tanganyika is a surprising story that has been forgotten and neglected over these past 60 years and more. But I should mention at the outset that not quite everyone neglected this story. Back in 1971, when the conference of the East African Institute of Social Research was held in the University of Nairobi, Walter Rodney, then teaching at the University of Dar es Salaam, offered a paper to the conference entitled Mau Mau in Tanganyika. Unfortunately, no copy of this paper has yet been found in the archive of the Rodney papers that we've searched, and it's missing from the collection of conference proceedings held in Nairobi and in Makerere. So we cannot be sure what Walter Rodney said, or even what he intended his work to do and to develop. And if anyone might be able to locate a copy of that paper by Rodney, we'd be very pleased to see it. In the meantime, we'll give our account of what we think happened, with all due respect to the great Walter Rodney, who may well have got there long before us. But before we give you the outline of this story, insofar as we've researched it thus far, we should perhaps first explain why this transnational aspect of Mau Mau's history has been overlooked up to now, and why we think it might be of some significance for our wider understanding of the Mau Mau movement. Now, we have to start with what other people have thought about Mau Mau in the past. And let's begin with the British government in Kenya in the 1950s. They claimed that Mau Mau was nothing more than a tribal movement. A local rising is how they described it in 1952. To admit anything more would have been a dangerous risk for the British government. Wary of an admission that Mau Mau rebels had any legitimate political claims, they chose to interpret Mau Mau in a way that narrowed its claims and reduced its status in international law. This was quite deliberate. It was a tactic and not just propaganda. Though the British never described the rising as cultural nationalism or even sub-nationalism at the time neither phrase was really used, these ideas of cultural nationalism and sub-nationalism have gained currency in historical literature on Mau Mau. And this is often linked coherently with other ethnic-based resistance movements in Kenya's past and present. So, the British colonial government in Kenya in the 1950s wanted us to think that Mau Mau was nothing more than a local rising. But I think we should reject that notion. Mau Mau was much more than a local rising. And even though its cultural dimensions among Kikuyu were strong and even definitive at times, they did not prevent the influence of the movement reaching far beyond Kenya's central province. Since 1963, the government of independent Kenya has claimed Mau Mau as a nationalist struggle. A national narrative has been developed. Variations upon it can be read on websites and indeed in school textbooks in Kenya. This narrative, beautifully summarized by Atenyo Odhiambo in his essay on the theses of Mau Mau, takes up the notions of reconciliation we heard about in our discussions yesterday and turns it to political purpose for Kenya's nation-building endeavor. We all fought for freedom, Kenyans were told. But then they were not expected to ask any further questions. Unity in struggle was thought to be enough, and there should be no more than that. More discussion about who actually did what in the emergency, where they did it, when they did it, and why they did it, might be dangerously divisive. In this way, the Kenyan state sought to silence the dissenting of voices who might claim that Mau Mau's demands have never been addressed, let alone satisfied. For these dissidents of various kinds, running all the way from the early 60s to the 1980s, and we learned a lot about them yesterday from other speakers, surely a luta continua, the struggle continued. And that is exactly what the Kenyan state did not want to happen. Of course, this explains in large part why Mau Mau's memory and Mau Mau's history is still so contested in Kenya. So, those who would have us believe that Mau Mau was a genuinely nationalistic revolt are perhaps too often concerned to dampen down their interpretations so that other questions that might not be asked, questions about the unity of that national vision and how widespread it actually was. I think we should also therefore reject the national narrative of Mau Mau, realizing that if Mau Mau was nationalist, and I do believe it was, then its nationalist forms were incomplete and not always fulfilled. They were invariably contested and were sometimes contradictory. And as a historian, I am not surprised by that. That's what I expect. But for a populist public audience, that can seem quite complicated. Yesterday, we heard Mickey Wanzia Costa remind us in a lecture that while Mau Mau was surely cultural in many significant ways, and has certainly formed the basis of a powerful national narrative, it was and still is global. Her lecture made connections to the civil rights movement in the USA, to Black Power, and to Pan-Africanism. Amplified eloquently in the published work of James Merriweather, and more recently Gerard Horne, we've known about these global and Pan-African connections for 20 years and more. But they don't seem to have penetrated the writing in Kenya on Mau Mau, and that sometimes surprises me. Now that we dig into the new archives that are coming available in other places and find new sources on Mau Mau's history, a fuller account of these Pan-Africanist trends has been emerging. And some of these sources are in Kenya, in Kenya's National Archive, such as the papers of Marumbe that sit in Nairobi. Of course, Mau Mau was not a global movement. It was a Kenyan movement. But its impact and influence extended very widely. In the rhetoric of global dissent, then, Mau Mau was and still is a force to be reckoned with. It has rhetorical power that is considerable. Now, even at the time of the emergency in the 50s, Mau Mau's reach as an image and an idea was considerable. The possibility of Mau Mau's influence fomenting rebellion in other places and among other peoples was precisely the anxiety that provoked British officials to seek to play down its significance. The role of Kamba supporters of the movement in Kenya was, to take one example, deliberately played down and suppressed by the British because they feared that might encourage other groups in Kenya to join the struggle. And we know now from the work of Miles Osborne and others that there was a really strong basis for that anxiety. And the range of support achieved beyond Central Province in Kenya for the movement is evident, I think, in several other pieces of historical information that we have. I've recently been reading papers on events at Hola around the time of the Hola massacre. And I was very struck that among the detainees injured and hospitalized on the day of the Hola attacks on the detainees, those who went to that hospital were not just Kikuyu. Among them were Kipsigis, Luo, Maasai, Kamba, Luya, and coastal peoples. These individuals were all among the so-called irreconcilables at Hola, who the state was trying to control and discipline. So there was much more than Kikuyu involved at Hola. Mau Mau may not have appeared then to represent nationalist struggle in Ruthagathi or in Thika, where everyone was Kikuyu. But at Hola, things looked very different. If we need perhaps to reconsider the participation of non-Kikuyu in Kenya's anti-colonial rebellion then, what about those across Kenya's borders? Transnationalism interpretations have never before been advanced as a purpose of the Mau Mau movement, though a number of historians, including Terence Ranger, have written about Mau Mau's international reach and its impact beyond Kenya through the Pan-Africanist connections of the KAU leadership. And here I think it's important to recognize that although the rank and file of the Mau Mau movement may not have shared such broadly based international perspectives, many of the leaders of the movement did and were conscious of the need to try to expand the movement's influence in this way. And evidence from Tanzania now provides us with indications that Mau Mau was indeed active across the borders, and that this was a matter of tactics and policy, not an accident of circumstances. So, did Mau Mau's leadership have an active policy to mount transnational rebellion, to spread Mau Mau to other parts of the colonial world? Difficult question to answer. The difficulty is, I think, twofold. Firstly, as far as we know from the sources we have, Mau Mau's leadership never coherently set out the goals of the movement. And what we know about that leadership has inclined most historians to think that they were in fact a house divided. There were multiple policies, different groups pushed different things. There's no obvious coherent pattern. But we do know that that leadership generally rejected cultural nationalist positions. They reached out to other ethnic groups within Kenya, and they tried to mobilize international support in several ways. These were by no means entirely successful, but there is enough to tell us that the intent was there. Second, Mau Mau, of course, changed over the duration of the emergency. As the struggle progressed, the movement responded and reacted to that struggle. The strongest evidence of cultural nationalism we have from within the movement comes late on, up in the high forests of Mount Kenya and the Aberdares, where in the latter part of the war, Mau Mau gangs were increasingly isolated and desperate. The rank and file of Mau Mau were almost certainly more strongly in favor of cultural nationalism than were their leadership. And by this later point in the emergency, the leadership of the movement was barely functioning at all. But that does not mean that Mau Mau supporters rejected transnationalism. Indeed, the Tanzanian evidence strongly suggests a coherent campaign to try to generate rebellion there. We argue here, therefore, that at least some elements of the Mau Mau movement embraced the transnational goal and made strenuous efforts to spread Mau Mau's rebellion abroad. So now let's turn to the Tanganyikan case and to discuss what it is we've discovered in the documents and in the oral histories, and to give some sense of the trajectory of what we think happened in Tanganyika. I should stress that this research is still ongoing, and we're planning more fieldwork in the coming year, more interviews in Tanganyika, more archive research in the UK, in Nairobi, and in Dar es Salaam. But I think we can, at this stage, sketch out an idea of what was happening. The first point we have to make is to establish quite clearly that by the 1950s, there was a very substantial Kikuyu diaspora outside of Kenya, mainly in Uganda and Tanganyika, and that population may have numbered as many as 150,000 by 1952. Now, this is a very interesting revelation because under colonialism, most historians of the region have assumed that mobility was heavily restricted, that Kenyans could not easily move out of their own so-called native reserves, never mind into neighboring colonies. But it's quite clear from the figures that the colonial state collected in the 1950s about the Kikuyu diaspora that large numbers of people had migrated into neighboring countries, despite these restrictions and controls. Now, some of these migrations were actually facilitated by the colonial state itself. And it turns out that the basis for the largest proportion of the Kikuyu population in Tanganyika was actually to be found in the policies of the Kenyan government in allowing forest squatters to be moved to Tanganyika in the interwar years. Beginning in 1926, but carrying on through into the 1930s, the colonial state in Kenya permitted groups of Kikuyu forest squatters to move to Tanganyika under the control and auspices of the Tanganyika Forestry Department. There, they had labor shortages, and they wanted African labor to work within the forests in just the way this happened in colonial Kenya. So they took numbers of Kikuyu squatters into Tanganyika. The larger proportion of these went to northern Tanganyika and to the Moshi and Arusha areas. And that is where this Mau Mau story in Tanganyika will be centered. And it's that community that is the vehicle of what then happens. When the emergency broke out in 1952, October 52, the emergency is declared in Kenya, Tanganyika is not thought at that point to be in any connection with the rebellion. But by early 1953, there are reports coming back to the Kenyan police, the colonial police in Nairobi, that Mau Mau in Kenya are reporting that oathing ceremonies have been held in northern Tanganyika, and that there are communities there that are affiliating with the rebellion. When the Kenyan colonial state starts to investigate this, they discover this is centered in the Arusha and Moshi areas and is being driven by the Kikuyu who have migrated to there in the interwar years and are now second, sometimes third generation settlers. At this point, the colonial state in Kenya consults with the Tanganyikan authorities, and Chief Mariala, who is pictured here with Governor Twining, gives a lot of information to assist them. And they agree to send down to Tanganyika an investigation team headed by special branch officers, but including district officers who will carry out interrogations of any suspects. In this way, in the early months of 1953, torture comes to Tanganyika. Investigations are set up at Moshi. Individuals are arrested, suspected of having taken oaths. The information for gathering these people together is gained from local informants among the Chaga, local Chaga community, and indeed among the Kikuyu community. Because once these investigations begin, what is revealed very quickly is that although some Kikuyu in this area have taken Mau Mau oaths, others are proclaiming themselves to be loyalists. So very quickly, intelligence is gathered from the loyalist community about what's been going on. Now, Governor Twining, who is the colonial governor in Tanganyika at this time, is very alarmed by these developments. Quite unlike Kenya, Tanganyika is, of course, a United Nations mandate, and Britain has to report on its activities in Tanganyika to the United Nations in great detail. So whereas things that go on in Kenya can be hushed up and concealed, that's a much harder task in Tanganyika. And the Tanganyikan administration has, by the early 1950s, developed a very different ethos and behavioral pattern to that of its neighbor next door to the north. So Twining is very alarmed indeed by the idea that Kenyan officers will come south into Tanganyika and will behave in the way they behave in Kenya. And he writes several very revealing letters to Governor Bering, his opposite number in Nairobi, complaining about the behavior of the Kenyan officers who come in and warning Bering that he will not tolerate this in Tanganyika and that there will be prosecutions should European officers exceed expected norms. And this is in fact what happens. A European officer beats prisoners and tortures them in Moshi. And the Tanganyika police move in and arrest him and put him on trial. This European officer, his name is Hayward, is a district officer from the Kenya regiment, a settler, basically. And he is convicted of torture and is sentenced to imprisonment in Tanganyika. Now, the Kenyan authorities are not happy about this at all. They think that their Tanganyika colleagues and comrades have let them down badly, and there is great animosity between the two colonies. And I think this is very interesting because what it reveals to us is that outside of Kenya, colonial officials in other parts of Africa were not supporting what was going on in Kenya at all. They were alarmed and distressed by it, and they did not want similar things to be happening in their colony. And by that, I don't mean the actions of Mau Mau, I mean the actions of the Kenyan colonial state. So the prosecution for torture is the first indication we get that there are real differences between how the two states will handle this problem. But the British investigations in early 1953 reveal that the support for Mau Mau in Tanganyika is actually much more widespread and much more deeply rooted than they had imagined. The local police report that there are what they call Mau Mau cells, groups of activists, in several other Tanganyikan towns, including in Dar es Salaam. And as a result of these reports, roundups of Mau Mau supporters and suspects are made in several Tanganyikan cities. And these individuals, some of them are put on trial in Tanganyika and prosecuted under sedition laws. Others are deported back to Kenya, where they are put into detention. So by early 53, the colonial state in Kenya realizes it has a serious problem with containing Mau Mau's influence into Tanganyika. And it's interesting that none of this is reported at the time. And all of the information about this that comes back to London is labeled top secret and is kept very quiet. Now, that initial attempt to silence and conceal what's going on is undermined quite seriously in the next phase that develops. In the town of Moshi, there is a murder of a leading Kikuyu loyalist in broad daylight in a busy duka area. The man is attacked by 3 other individuals and is savagely hacked with a panga, a very public assassination of an informer. It's impossible to hide this. It's widely reported. It appears in the Tanganyika press, and even the international press carries the story about murder in Moshi. And indeed, Time magazine in America carries an article called Invasion of the Lion Men, in which they describe the movement of Mau Mau fighters into Tanganyika to spread the revolt there. Now, with this kind of media interest blowing up, the British found it very hard to contain this story. So at this point, people begin to know something about the fact that Mau Mau is penetrating northern Tanganyika. The response to this within Tanganyika is quick and quite decisive. Governor Twining is very aware that the problem could get worse, so he agrees to declare a state of emergency in northern Tanganyika. So just like Kenya's emergency, Tanganyika has one too. But in Tanganyika, this emergency only covers the Northern Territory along the border with Kenya and into Arusha and Moshi. King's African Rifles are deployed into the area and local patrols are set up. Intelligence gathered quickly reveals that there are not one, but at least 2 Mau Mau gangs operating in the area, and that one of these gangs is allegedly said to be responsible for the murder in Moshi. These soldiers have some quick success in tracking down at least one of the gangs, and they kill several of the fighters, and they manage to arrest 2 or 3 more who are put on trial in Tanzania. The Tanganyikan government has to pass new laws to permit all of this to happen, and they're put under pressure again by Kenya to use the Kenyan laws on the emergency regulations. Again, Twining refuses to do this and says that those laws are not appropriate for Tanganyika because it is a mandated territory, and they have to be much more careful what they do and how they treat people. So Twining devises his own regulations, the main one of which is a registration act that forces all non-Tanganyikan nationals to register their presence in parts of rural Tanganyika. So all Kikuyu in Tanganyika from this point onwards have to be registered and their identity acknowledged. Now, he sets up this register very quickly, and within a few months, we have lists of all of the Kikuyu who are resident in Tanganyika, and these lists are in the archive. So we know the names of these people, and we know roughly where they were resident. We may not have a full address for them, but we know roughly where they were resident. So from this, we begin to get a clearer picture of how widespread this Kikuyu diaspora is and how thickly populated parts of Tanganyika are with Kikuyu. But analyzing the problem as a security issue, Twining is very concerned that the border between Kenya and Tanzania should be sealed to prevent further incursions from Mau Mau groups. So the Tanganyika authorities set about organizing a local militia to assist them to do this and to police and patrol the border areas. At the same time, across the border in Kenya, the Kenyan authorities are trying to examine how it is that Mau Mau gangs, apparently unknown to Kenyan intelligence officers, had made their way across the border into Tanganyika from Kenyan Maasai land. So much of this investigation focuses on Kajiado and Narok. And in these areas, very quickly, they focus on what the colonial officials term the Kikuyu half-breeds in this area. And that phrase, I apologize for that phrase, but it's the phrase used in the files, in all the reports. It's widely used at the time. And I think it's important you know that. This is the disparaging term that is used. So suspicion falls on all those in the Maasai areas of mixed ethnicity, those of Kikuyu and Maasai background. Now, of course, this Kenyan audience doesn't need me to tell them that that means a very large proportion of the population in Kajiado and Narok. But these people are put under suspicion, and the colonial state in Kenya then begins rounding up these people and interrogating them. So in Kajiado and Narok, through 1954 and into 1955, there is a major campaign to remove Kikuyu from this area. So individuals are interrogated, and those who are thought to have Mau Mau sympathies are placed into detention. We don't yet know how many people this involved, but we hope in our investigations and research in the coming year, we'll get a clearer picture of what happened, where it happened, and who it happened to. Back in Tanganyika, the Kenyans put great pressure on the Tanganyikans to put Kikuyu suspects into detention. And after much discussion, in which Governor Twining again tries very hard to prevent the Kenyans getting their way, it's decided that detention camps should be established in Tanganyika. Now, we still have much research to do into this aspect of the story as well. We now know where these camps were. We know something about them, but our future research will investigate much more closely what exactly happened to these people and where they were put. We know that one camp was established in northeast of Handeni at a place called Tomota, and that was what was termed an open camp for those who had been classified as gray Mau Mau. They used the same pipeline classification that was used in Kenya. So these are people who there are suspicions around them, but they're not thought to be hardcore Mau Mau supporters. So Tomota camp, northeast of Handeni, holds the Greys. At Miombo, to the west of Dodoma, there is a hardcore camp. And what we've seen of the images of this camp so far indicate it looks just like the hardcore camps in Kenya. There are barbed wire fences, watchtowers, spotlights, trenches, spiked trenches, gates, all the things that are familiar to Kenyans from their knowledge of detention camps in Kenya. Miombo had at least 500 people held there. We think possibly more, but again, we're still investigating. We found reports of certain rehabilitation officers who were Tanganyikans, Black Tanganyikans, who were employed in this institution, and we know something of the daily routine of the camp, but not yet quite enough to say a lot about it. But our first impressions are that it's been run on very similar lines to the Kenyan camps. Aside from these detention camps, the Tanganyikan government also decides that they need to protect the loyalist Kikuyu who've given evidence against Mau Mau, especially those in Moshi and Arusha. So just as in Kenya, safe haven is given to these people. And arrangements are made to resettle loyalist Kikuyu
you're
from
running
these
out of time.
areas into, thank you, I'll be finished in just 2-3 minutes, into these areas to move them to other parts of Tanganyika. So Kikuyu settlement areas are created in the central and southern provinces. And Dr. Magoti has been conducting interviews with these communities. Others are repatriated straight back to Kenya, especially those who are suspected of having maybe weaker Mau Mau links, but maybe open to persuasion to support the Mau Mau groups. Again, we're not yet sure of the exact numbers, but it's certainly in the thousands. At least 12,000 are repatriated. We're trying to find out exactly what happened to this group. We know that some were taken to Dar es Salaam, went by boat up to Mombasa, then were taken on a secure train up to Central Province. Others we know were moved in lorries across the border back into Kenya. We know from some of the evidence we've looked at already that some of these people, once they arrived back in Kenya, went straight into detention. We don't know if that happened to them all. We think the majority of those who repatriated at this point were probably women and children, but we don't know exactly where they went. So we'll be exploring the archives in Nairobi and to a lesser extent in London to see if we can find out where they were put. So this aspect of the story is really quite surprising and quite troubling, but reveals something that we really need to find out more about and investigate more closely. Coming towards the end now, once they'd sorted out what they thought was the diaspora community in this way, the British then set up much stronger border controls for the regulation of movement and for state surveillance. So in conclusion, I want to comment in conclusion on sources, just very briefly. Our study combines oral histories, local Tanzanian and Kenyan archives, and migrated archive papers in London. We're fortunate in being able to access all of these kinds of material so that we can do what all good historians should do and triangulate evidence between our sources. The writing of Mau Mau's history, though, has been bedeviled in the past by constraints upon access to sources. Those researchers in Kenya can't access the migrated archive. Although the British destroyed much evidence on the Mau Mau period, it remains true that a surprisingly large quantity of material is to be found in the K&A in Nairobi. It's not always easy to find this material in Nairobi, and the finding aids in the archive are barely adequate for the task and require a great deal of knowledge and patience to use. But the information is there. And after many years in which locally based Kenyan historians largely ignored these kinds of sources, I'm very pleased to see that in recent years that has changed and that a new generation of Kenyan researchers is now taking up the challenges of this archival work. Few Kenyans, however, make the journey to London to be able to view papers available in the National Archive at Kew in London. There is, in fact, far more material in Nairobi than is ever held in London, yet some of the papers in London, perhaps especially those in the Migrated Archive, are of great importance and really should be made available in Nairobi. Some of these papers, though by no means all, have in fact been copied and have been made available to K&A, although they've not, as far as I'm aware, yet been released to readers there. So maybe local historians might want to inquire why that should be the case. Here in the UK, we are still campaigning to have all of the Migrated Archive copied and returned to Kenya verbatim. And we thank those Kenyans who have supported us in this endeavor. Although I have to say, I'm sorry to say, it doesn't seem to me likely that this will happen in the near future. But interestingly, some of the most insightful sources we've used in this study come not from the Kenyan Migrated Archive, but from the Tanzanian Migrated Archive, because we must not forget that every colony has its own migrated archive. So just as the writing of Pan-Africanist and global histories of Mau Mau's influence has required the study of archives beyond Kenya, the same is true of transnational history also. Thank you very much.
Let us appreciate Mzee Anderson, the Kenyan style, for a very insightful provocative, informative presentation, which is also very well presented. Professor has raised a lot of issues that I'm sure a lot of us did not know about. I want to just mention from the last ones going backwards. For example, the issue of news sources in form of the migrated Tanzanian archives, to what was happening across the board, and also raising issues and questions about what happened to those fellows who were brought to detention camps in Kenya, because as we have just learned, their home was in Tanzania. So after detention, where did they go? Those are questions maybe local historians are going to be able to answer. Now, I'm not an historian per se, but I hang around the history corridors and the historians. So I'd like to invite Dr. Kenneth Ombongi, who is the historian, to be able to chambua what the professor has been telling us. Dr. Kenneth Ombongi is an Order of the Grand Warrior. That is an official connotation from the people of Kenya. He has written a lot and done a lot of research on the histories of medicine, modern science, especially malaria, and also recently COVID-19. He has also written on written and commented on other subjects such as politics in Gusii land, politics in Mvita, that is in the coast. And he has also written about the histories of water supply, and even in very interesting topics like the politics about coffee and tea, in a paper that he provocatively calls the steaming cups. He was dedicated here in Africa at the University of Nairobi. He's one of the few lucky scholars who have transcended 3 continents. After here, he went to Asia, and then he terminated in Britain, where he shared the same classrooms at different times with David Anderson. Karibu sana, Daktari.
Thank you, David Kule, for that very big introduction for a small man like me. Good morning. And this morning here in Nairobi, I know in some areas where some of the people listening to us is afternoon. Good afternoon, those who are in zones which are afternoon, and good evening for our friends who are in the zones that is evening. Now, Professor Anderson, very interesting presentation. David is influenced in some way by ideas of our common teacher and friend, Londesell, who we met at different times, and I actually saw him on the online platform. And also, David Anderson was once an associate member of this Department of History and Archaeology here in Nairobi. And I want to believe that at the time he was here in the 80s, he was very much aware of the controversial debates that we were referring to yesterday about Mau Mau. They were extremely controversial, not least abrasive debates in the department in those times, and I'm sure Professor Anderson found them when he was here. Consistently, and this is quite interesting, he has worked just like our common teacher. He has worked on Kenya, so I can gladly and very confidently say that he's a Kenyanist by excellence, starting with his early interest in the ecological history of the Central Rift Valley. And then he moved on and did some work on politics and the state. And of course, he had to be initiated to an area which every Kenyanist around the world has to be initiated to, and that is the Mau Mau, when he published his work, The Histories of the Hanged which is quite a good read, both for our graduate and the undergraduate students. Now he seems to be moving increasingly to become a Pan-Africanist in a sense, moving to Tanganyika, Tanzania. And that brings us to the presentation that he has made today in a very fairly exhaustive way on a paper that he has entitled Mau Mau in Tanganyika Towards a Transitional History of Kenya's Anti-Colonial Rebellion. And this is, as he clearly indicated, a product of teamwork, touching colleagues in Dar es Salaam and colleagues in Cologne, and of course him from the UK. Now, generally, as I follow this discussion, he started his presentation from a premise of two contradictory understanding of the Mau Mau movement. One imperial and the other national. One that aimed at giving us a portrait of a tribal insurgency that never went beyond the confines of what we popularly call in Kenya here, Mount Kenya. The other one is a portrait of a struggle for freedom that enabled the political elites of the country in the 60s and the following decade, at least to shout for once that we are free at last. And Mau Mau did it. And it has become part of our heritage, which we are supposed to celebrate, and not anything beyond beyond there. But one interesting thing when you look at the two contending views of Mau Mau that Professor Anderson gave us is that they had a common denominator. And that common denominator is that they constituted basically a very expedient appropriation of Mau Mau for purposes of political survival. One, by an imperial government that his future was very uncertain in Kenya. And two, the post-independent government that realized very early in its life that we were better off not talking a lot and discussing very much about Mau Mau because it could easily become a threat to the nascent Kenyan state by the local elites. Now, he seems to really disagree with those two notions, the imperial one and the state-centric one that was very dominant locally here, with all the trappings of Mau Mau as a nationalist movement, the setting up of the archives, the glorious national holidays that we have. In fact, we set this conference to coincide with the eve of what used to be called Kenyatta Day, what we call now, according to our new constitution 2010, Mashujaa Day, which is going to be celebrated tomorrow. And that's why, as a department, we thought we'll set this to coincide to enable us to rethink about this important movement. And of course, the government has helped all along to create the heroes of Mau Mau, who we are supposed to celebrate. And it seems like if we continue at the rate we are doing, everybody will become a hero or a heroine of Mau Mau. a movement to be celebrated and not exactly beyond that. And Professor Anderson seems to, disagree with those notions and move to what he sees as Mau Mau, a transnational movement, and provided a very interesting transnational discussion using the example of what happened in the northern parts of Tanzania in what sounded like Mau Mau beyond the boundaries of Kenya. And he aptly put it, I think even from what we heard from Mickey Mwansia Costa yesterday, that Mau Mau had a very important ideological influence on the civil rights movement in the United States. If you listen to the speeches of many civil rights activists, like the Malcolm X that we listened to yesterday, of course, the most celebrated among them, Martin Luther King Jr. You listen to his speech. I think there's one that he clearly refers to Nairobi in the 60s as one of the centers that were bringing fundamental change that was geared to change the world for good forever. Beyond, of course, the United States, there has been works that have come up, of course, from media reports of the influence of Mau Mau or across the world. And these have made a lot of sense, particularly in the time we are living on, when everybody's clutching on these clarion calls of Black Lives Matter, roads must fall. I'm sure we are very familiar with some of these very emotional messages that are coming across. But also he made it fairly clear that there is a way in which the Mau Mau movement had very important Pan-Africanist credentials, and it affected the thinking of liberation in many other regions of the continent. And I was recently in a function celebrating the Algerian Day of Independence. And when I listened to the speakers, for once I thought that they had forgotten about the war revelation in Algeria, and they were more talking about Mau Mau. And that really convinced me that there is a way in which Mau Mau influenced the kind of thinking about liberation, about the rights of the privileged in the rest of Africa. So I think Mau Mau rebellion abroad is a theme that deserves a lot of attention, so that to repudiate these notions that the colonial apologists seem to battle around about Mau Mau being a tribal uprising, a peasant movement that came about because of certain social and structural causes within a fairly localized context. He clearly demonstrated how things changed very dramatically in northern Tanzania, including actually a declaration of the state of emergency. This is something that I've not come across before, and how the British authorities in Tanganyika tried to control this within the limits of the mandate, the United Nations mandate that they had over Tanzania. So in a nutshell, this promises to be a very interesting study once they finalize the research, as he indicated, and we look forward to read this. Now, besides that, there are other very interesting things that I had in between the lines of Anderson's presentation. One, of course, is as he spoke, for once I thought, could it be possible that we are lending credence to what I can loosely call the invincibility of Mau Mau, in quotes, you know, that seems very strongly, you know, to undermine the development of the Kenyan state, because the way Mau Mau has caused a lot of controversies in its narrative and the debates, and it created a sense of entitlement, as we saw yesterday. You know, overemphasizing its international and transnational credentials. Is there a possibility that we are entrenching this within the context of narratives and debates of the controversies that surround the Mau Mau movement, particularly in Kenya? And I'm saying this, friends, recognizing the fact that it's only possible now to have a conference like this one in the corridors of the University of Nairobi. I don't think whether it could have been possible, you know, a decade or 2 decades from back if we did that. I said in the opening of this conference that if you invited the kind of people that I had invited to this meeting, the likes of Wau Kahara, the likes of the Mwakenya, the members of the Mwakenya movements of the 90s, in the time when I was an undergraduate student in this university, on Monday night, I could have not slept in my house. I could have been a guest of the state. So we have come quite a long way. And I was wondering whether the overemphasis that we want to lay on this important international dimension of Mau Mau has the likelihood of perpetuating the appropriation of Mau Mau in such a ways that continue to cause what one presenter yesterday called marginalization of certain regions in the country. Probably, Dave, you might want to make a comment on that. Number 2, we talk about Tanganyika and Kenya, and I listened to David very keenly, as if they were very different geographical regions. You see, minus the coterminous colonial boundaries, the distinctions we draw between Kenya and Tanganyika might not be socially and culturally important in my view. You see, the divided social aggregates that reside across the borders of these 2 colonial territories are actually not very different from one another. Colonial boundaries, by their very nature, were arbitral. They were set up actually not to serve local but imperial interests. But when you look at the real world on the ground, how effective were they as boundaries? Anderson talked about you know, the Maasai in Kajiado. And I was reading in preparation to this presentation that some of the migrants, you know, that he talked about were not just Kikuyu, but they included the Maasai, the Taita, the Akamba, who are just nearby these international colonial boundaries. A student of mine, James Ndungu, did some small MA project, which he entitled Borders Boundaries. Very contradiction. But he came up with a very interesting thesis that some of the so-called international boundaries are actually not boundaries to the people who live around them. And he was using the case of the Dasanach in northern Kenya and southern Ethiopia, who cross these boundaries at will without taking into account any international conventions that govern them. So I think then, David, I was wondering whether what you see as Tanganyika and what you see as Kenya were socially and culturally boundaries that divided people across the borders. And if that is the case, then was Mau Mau becoming international, or it was becoming expanding the areas which it affected within more or less the same region? I want to hear your comment on that. And finally, I was just wondering, does the spread to another region or another territory make Mau Mau international, quote unquote? Because when I listened to David speak, he kept on talking about the Kikuyu diaspora in Tanzania, the Kikuyu suspects, the Kikuyu this and the Kikuyu that. And at once I was wondering, are we seeing some contradiction in what he's saying? Because he was trying to run away very much from the very colonial portrait of Mau Mau being a tribal movement. And here we are finding Kikuyus moving to Tanzania, or what was then called Tanganyika, and we still call it international when it is actually local people who moved, quote unquote, to cause trouble elsewhere. Thank you very much.
I think today is a very exciting day. We have had Dr. Ombongi debunking the myth of the Mau Mau. He has asked questions to Professor about the decentralization of Mau Mau from Mount Kenya, the Kikuyunizing the Mau Mau, and so on and so forth. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Ombongi for that very insightful discussion there. And we would like to open the floor for questions. I think we are going to be liberal. We have about 8 minutes before we go for the health break. So I'd like us to start with the people from the audience. We'll probably take maybe 2 or 3 questions. And then we will allow Prof to respond to those. And then after that, we'll get a bout of questions from our online audience. I think we have about 50. A few minutes ago, I saw 60. I don't know how many we are now. So who would like to start? Let's see. I'm going to be biased and have Professor Mwaruvye here because we were roommates. He hosted me at Moi University when we were just employed. And then I will have Ben and Justus.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. I also want to thank Professor Anderson for that stimulating discussion. My name is Professor John Mwaruvye from Karatina University, where I am the coordinator of Center for Mau Mau and other liberation movements. Actually, listening to his talk, I'm realizing that we Kenyans are very lazy in doing research. And that probably is what has caused the division that we normally come across. And I think what is emerging is that there is need to demystify Mau Mau and the ownership of Mau Mau. In fact, when you read through our literature, there is no Kenyan community that fought the Kikuyus because they were Mau Mau. None. Secondly, when you read more, you'll find that even in Moi's biography, he talks about Mau Mau passing through Baringo. Definitely, they were also assistant. The Maasai were involved. The Gusis were involved. Now I have evidence that even in Kware, there was Mau Mau, and not by Kikuyus. Now here, we are now hearing of Mau Mau in Tanganyika. And I want to say this, is a good work, opening the horizons. And therefore, there is need for historians in Kenya now to do more research on this subject. To end my contribution to this is to support the idea that there were many Kenyans in Tanzania. And one of them actually ended up being a minister in Tanzania, James Mungai. He was born in 1943 in Iringa by a Kikuyu and was a biological relative with Akina James Mungai Njoroge, which means then, as migrants there, they could not have been detached with the struggle that was going on here. And therefore, I support strongly what Professor Anderson was presenting. Thank you.
Asante sana, Prof. There is a challenge, a very huge challenge for historians. Then, Dr. Nyechonga.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Perhaps I'm the one who didn't get the story very well because I came in late. But at least for me, the way I've understood it, Mau Mau must have been a Kikuyu affair from the presentation which has been made. This is because even the colonial government themselves or itself knew that Mau Mau was all about the Kikuyu. Anderson has mentioned something there. I don't know whether that term was coined by the British government or the colonialists, or it is himself who has coined it. Half-breeds. What does it mean here? It means that, there is an offshoot of some other communities that came in much later, or later after the Kikuyus, who claimed to be Mau Mau, and yet they were not. Unless I don't understand what that term means. So for me, I think he has put the record very right, that the Mau Mau was indeed a Kikuyu affair. Elsewhere, you know where we come from, it must have been just an uprising against the British occupation. And I tend to understand that Mau Mau was, practiced or executed in a different way, using certain ceremonies that were characteristic of the Kikuyu. From the way I'm seeing, Mau Mau must have been something characteristic to a given community in this case. Thank you very much. Maybe I didn't understand it very well.
Asante sana, Dr. Nyechonga. I am sure Prof will address that. I think it was before you came in, but he gave examples of why the colonial administration did not want other communities to be seen as part of the Mau Mau. And he gave the reason that it was because they were scared that it will keep on expanding more. So anybody outside Kikuyu land, the information, according to him, the way I understood it, was deliberately surprised, but that's not for me to say. The Prof is online, he's going to address that. Yes, Justice?
Thank you for the chance. I want to bring in Mwalimu Nyerere into this. I'm just wondering, Nyerere being born in Butiama and Mara region, which is part of northern Tanganyika, could he have come in contact with this activity in northern Tanganyika at this time? And this on the basis that when he took power eventually, Nyerere had this passion for liberation movements, and hopefully you know that he hosted a number of them. The country, particularly the likes of ANC, and of course, Frelimo from Mozambique. And when he took power, when again he was the president, I've read about him and watched a number of documentaries. He had this love for an East African, can I say, community. And he says that many a time was in Nairobi trying to convince Mr. Jomo Kenyatta on the need to come together. So probably, and then he talks about that, according to him, there was something about Kenya and Tanganyika. So is it possible, maybe Prof, as you answer this, that Nyerere was informed by the activities going on of Mau Mau in northern Tanganyika back then?
Asante sana, Justice. And while Prof is doing that, perhaps you can also mention something about the two pictures that were in the slide. The first one, where Nyerere was, and the second one, there were two people that he never told us who they are. I think I'm going to be generous and take just one more question from this audience. The first hand to come up. 2, 3,
How about
gone.
us?
Okay. Professor Henderson.
Chule, we are online. Chule, we are online and we want to raise an issue.
I had said earlier that we would take a bout of questions from the physical audience, and then after Prof addresses that, then we'll go to the second round from the online audience. Did you understand?
Yes, thanks.
I had said that we'll take around a bout of questions.
Thank you. Good,
then after Professor Anderson addresses that, then we'll give a chance to the online audience.
Thank you.
You understand that? Proceed.
Did you want me to reply to the questions now? I'm not hearing you.
Just go ahead, Prof. We can hear you loud and clear.
Thank you. So, thank you for those questions. And I'm pleased to have stimulated a debate. I think that's what these events should be about. Firstly, to Dr. Nchaga, let me be clear. The phrase half-breeds is not my choice. I find it a deeply offensive phrase, but it is the word used in all of the archived documents. So it was the word used by the British at the time. It's not a word I would choose. Then to clarify on my view of is Mau Mau a Kikuyu affair? What I'm trying to get across is that of course it is a Kikuyu affair, but that its leadership wanted it to be wider and bigger. And they did things repeatedly to try and achieve that. So they are aware that they're more likely to be successful if they can turn this into a truly national or even transnational revolt. So they are doing things actively to try to achieve that. As I said, they're not entirely successful by any means. But the important point, I think, is what they are seeking to achieve. They do not see themselves as a small local rising. That's the point. And of course, to come to the issue of, is it a national narrative or a local rising? My point is that it is really both, not neither. There are elements of these explanations in the reality. We struggle, I think, sometimes with explaining the Mau Mau past because we look for a single solution, a single explanation. Mau Mau was a complex movement. It was made up of many different parts. And I think we have to be more sensitive to that and aware of it. Also, as I tried to stress in the presentation, the movement changes its character over time. As the rebellion mounts, some things become more difficult to achieve, and the movement shifts its ground. So the Mau Mau who are left in the forest by 1958 are a very different entity than the men who wanted to stimulate rebellion in October 1952. So we have to see that change and understand it. Mau Mau became something different through that forest experience. Last comment I will make is, I was asked about the pictures. The first picture that was a postcard from 1964 of a TANU meeting. And it's just to illustrate Tanzanian politicians around this time. In relation to that, I'm not aware that Nyerere or TANU were involved in anything to do with this story, but I'm sure that TANU politicians and activists in the Northern Territory of Tanganyika must have known this was going on. So one of the things that we're now doing is thinking about, can we interrogate the archive files again and see what we can find out about this? Can we go back and look at the nationalist histories that Tanzanians have written about themselves and find out what residuals there may be there about this story? Because when we have looked in other kinds of sources, rather surprisingly, we found stuff sitting there about this material. So we do think that there's a possibility that TANU were aware of some of this. However, I've not seen anything that suggests a connection between TANU and Mau Mau directly. The second picture I showed to answer the compare's question was of Governor Twining and Chief Morelli. And that was shown to illustrate, because he was the Chaga leader who assisted the government in informing on what he thought were the Mau Mau activists in his area. I should point out, though, that, and this leads to the point about other ethnic groups being involved in Mau Mau, it is definitely the case that even in Tanganyika, other ethnic groups were involved. Many Maasai assisted those Mau Mau gangs who crossed the border. We know this because it appears even in the police reports of what is going on at the time. Other locals in the area, including Chaga, also assisted them. And we know that many Chaga also took those oaths in Arusha and Moshi. We also know that Chaga children, indeed the children of the local Chaga chiefs, were going to school in Githunguri at this time. The independent schools took children from the Chaga area. Why? Why? Because Kikuyu political leaders had connections with this area through the Meru land case. They were aware of the activism and they worked together. This is one of the Pan-Africanist connections that binds this story together. So when the colonial officials go to Arusha to investigate, they are very surprised to discover that there are Chaga children in central Kenya at school. Now that leads on to the point that was made about that Kenneth made about the borders. You know, borders are of course fluid. Throughout the colonial period, the colonial state liked to think borders were fixed. They were not. As Kenneth Mbongi rightly says, people moved back and forth through them more or less as they wished. But it's ironic that because of this event, at the very moment of independence in the early 1960s, the border between Kenya and Tanganyika was at that point probably more heavily policed and surveilled than it had ever been, or that it ever would be in the future. So there's a brief moment in which the border is controlled, but it is only a brief moment. And then one last comment to make is about demystifying Mau Mau. I very much appreciated that comment from the first questioner, because I think that we have to sort of move towards a wider acceptance that Mau Mau can be many different things. We don't have to have a singular interpretation. We have to accept some of the ambiguities. And that may not be easy for a Kenyan public or even a British public to accept, but we have to accept it. And the last point to make is, of course, that for Kenyans, Mau Mau has a particular set of meanings that they wish to understand through their own political system. Well, please, in Kenya, realize also, here in Britain, Mau Mau has a very strong place in our history because it's become so important in the revelations about our imperialism. So here in the UK as well, there's a very strong interest in understanding what happened. And we get many, many students in our universities who wish to take courses about Mau Mau. It's one of the most popular things that we teach here. Thank you.
I'd like to take this opportunity to invite our online audience. I'll take questions, 2 questions that are going to last 1 minute, and then we will allow Prof to answer within 5 minutes all the questions so that we can also have time for a health break. I was asking that question earlier, was making that comment earlier. I have quite a number of comments here. Yes, sir. Do we have any questions from our online audience?
Kule, my hand is up. Kule.
Please go ahead. Go ahead.
I go ahead. Eh? Okay. Thank you so much. Partly my question has been answered by the professor in his clarification. But there is another strong view about the Mau Mau, that the Mau Mau was about the Kikuyu land. And what has that to do with the liberation? It has to do with the liberation because it fired the idea that Kenyans needed to have back their land. Luyas did not have a problem with Luya land. I'm not sure that Luos had a problem with land and the colonialists. So the intention, as Professor is putting it, was to nationalize it or internationalize it as a freedom struggle movement. However, to claim internationalism or nationalism is a bit, I'm not sure that there is a lot of evidence to back that. 2, I would like Professor to make a comment on the link between Kenya's independence, the struggle for freedom, and the Kapenguria 6. If you look at the Kapenguria 6, you notice that the majority may not necessarily have been part of the Mau Mau movement. Thank you.
I think we can allow just one more question. Just one more.
Can I go ahead? Can I ask a question?
Pig bean.
Hello, can I ask a question?
Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I do appreciate the great presentation here. One question that I'd like the professor to confirm was, it is in sources that the initial constitution of Kenya, the independent constitution, was not Kenyan originated constitution, but rather a constitution given to Kenya by the Britain government or the Britain court. I need you to clarify whether the initial constitution was originating from Kenya or it was the UK constitution given to Kenya. Second thing is that we have made a lot of history and a lot of reference in Mau Mau struggle. I just met one of the pioneers on Monday, and the key issue is, even despite of the struggle of Mau Mau and even the independence, the Mau Mau real fighters are still suffering today. They haven't gained land, and in fact, one of them said, we have Madaraka, but not independence. So how do we as a movement, or as a team, or as a conference here, fight forward to ensure that despite of recognizing their history and appreciating their history, how do you ensure that they are in the right place in the history of this country so that they can enjoy the fruits of their sweat and their suffering? Thank you.
Going to let Prof address those 2. And
Okay.
From the text, from the chat, I could see that Mickey was asking a question which the professor answered, but then that also raises another question. Why is the Kenya government reluctant to request for the retrieval of the material in London? Maybe you can also talk about that. We'll give you just about 4 minutes, Prof, because we are really running out of time. Asante.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll be quick. So, Francis, thank you for your very good question. Of course, Mau Mau is about land. But I think what I'm trying to get across, Francis, is the idea that the local issues around Kikuyu mobilization and activism, that is what empowers Mau Mau. That's what makes men go to the forests. That's what makes them pick up arms. But the leadership of the movement, those who are trying to foment and coordinate rebellion, also have other ambitions. They want to overthrow colonialism. And to do that, you need more than Kikuyu land coming back to you. You need wider support. And it's not a contradiction to say that these two things exist side by side in the same movement. It's not a contradiction. You don't have to have one or the other. You can have both. But the rank and file of the movement may not have been so concerned about the international and transnational aspects. They may not have cared a fig for that because they wanted land. But that doesn't mean that the leadership did not have broader and wider ambitions. As for the Kapenguria 6, I don't think there's really much I can comment. Those who were arrested in Operation Jock Scott tended to be those who were not tipped off that they were all about to be arrested. So almost by definition, those who get caught tend to be those who were a bit slower to react to the information they received. You're quite right, not all of them are Mau Mau supporters or activists, though some are. But I think, again, this is a topic on which we could do more research, and there's more historical writing that could be done. I think this needs more exploration. Then coming to Pigbin's question, the constitution that Kenya gets is negotiated with the Kenyan political parties at the time. It's drafted by the British, yes, but in consultation. It's not the same as the British Constitution. Britain doesn't have a written constitution. There's not one you can model it on. But Kenya's constitution is somewhat similar to the constitution settled with some other colonies at the same time. So there was a model and a template that was being evolved by the British through their various negotiations with colonies. And the Kenyan model resembles, therefore, some of those settlements made with other countries. But crucially, the principles behind that constitution of an electoral process, first past the post system, a majority government, a government and an opposition, all of those characteristics of the system are British by design. Although Kenya, you should remember, came quite close to having a very different constitution. It might have had a federal constitution had politics worked out rather differently. And then the last question that our compere has asked me about why the Kenyan government is reluctant to pursue the question of the migrated archive. I am a little puzzled by this myself. We have been told when we've made inquiries that the government, at least your last government before the recent election, they thought that this was a divisive issue and that not everyone wanted the migrated archives to come back. And some people thought that there might be some dangerous elements within those documents that they wouldn't want Kenyans to see. The archivist in Nairobi has tried to get them back, but has been unable to get cabinet level support for his requests. So he's got partial success, but not complete success. My feeling is that if the Kenyan government at cabinet level were to approach the British about the return of copies of the migrated archive, that this would be more likely to be achieved, but that's not been forthcoming.
Thank you so much, Prof. We have got quite a number of questions also in the chat, especially from Peter Wekesa, but and others. I'd like to urge everybody to be able to follow the chat so that you can know what people are talking about. At this point, we are running out of time, and I'd like us to be able to break for just 5 minutes, well, 6 minutes for our health break, and then we'll be back here at exactly 11:40, and then Dr. Mary, and she's just walking in. Mary will be able to take over the next session. And so we have just about 6 minutes. Just amuka, peleka mkono tu hivi, you know, just to stretch so that we can be ready for the next session. Asanteni sana. And thank you very much, Prof. Once again, thank you so much.